We all know the line, with great power comes great responsibility. It's one of the most famous sentences in comic book history, and I think we've been reading it wrong. Because for Peter Parker, responsibility wasn't a virtue, it was weight, something that arrived and never let him put it down. I learned that difference the day I became a dad, one of the greatest moments of my life. In the moment I realized there was no clocking out anymore, because there's a kind of responsibility where doing your best still isn't enough, and rest starts to feel undeserved. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, and this is the story of Spider-Man, and what it cost when responsibility never lets you choose yourself. Peter Parker didn't wake up one day and decide to be responsible. It happened all at once, and it started with Uncle Ben. Peter Parker didn't fail by being cruel. He failed by being human. He was tired. He was frustrated. He was finally good at something, and for once, it was his. So when he let the thief run past him, it wasn't because he wanted harm. It was because he didn't care. And that's what makes the moment so devastating. Peter doesn't watch Uncle Ben die because he chose evil. He watches him die because he chose indifference. And the universe never lets him forget it. There is no training arc, no gradual acceptance, no moment where Peter is allowed to grow into the weight. 1 second, he's a kid who wants something for himself. The next, someone he loves is dead because he didn't act. That's not just a lesson, it's a life sentence for one mistake. Because Uncle Ben's death doesn't just teach Peter that power must be used responsibly, it teaches him something far more dangerous, that he believes goodness is now conditional. From here on out, Peter isn't allowed to simply be good, he has to prove it, over and over and over again. Every life he saves becomes evidence, every crime he stops becomes repayment, every bruise becomes currency, and the worst part? There's no finish line. Uncle Ben doesn't get unkilled, the moment doesn't resolve, the guilt doesn't fade with time, it compounds. Peter doesn't ask what's the right thing to do, he asks what happens if I don't, because he already knows the answer. He didn't choose responsibility, responsibility claimed him, and once it does, there's no off-ramp. If he stops, someone dies. If he rests, he risks repeating the worst moment of his life. And if he chooses himself, he feels like he's stealing time he never earned. So he keeps going. Not because it feels heroic, not because it feels good, but because stopping feels immoral. Uncle Ben's death doesn't turn Peter into a hero, it turns him into a debtor. And from that point forward, Spider-Man isn't chasing justice, he's chasing absolution. But absolution never comes, because you can't undo the moment that created the debt. You can only keep paying it and hope that someday it's enough. Miles Morales is often described as the hopeful Spider-Man, but hope isn't what separates him from Peter Parker. Choices. Miles doesn't become Spider-Man because of a mistake he can never undo. He becomes Spider-Man because someone believes in him, and because eventually, he believes in himself. That distinction changes everything. When Miles is bitten, he doesn't inherit a moral sentence. He inherits potential. He's scared. He doubts himself. He fails. But he fails forward, with room to learn, room to hesitate, room to grow. Peter never gets that. Peter's origin teaches him that hesitation kills people. Miles' origin teaches him that growth takes time. And because of that, responsibility shapes him differently. Miles wants to be Spider-Man. Peter feels obligated to be Spider-Man. Because responsibility that is chosen becomes part of your identity. Responsibility that is inherited becomes a weight you're afraid to put down. Miles doesn't carry a ledger, he carries a legacy. And those are not the same thing. A legacy invites you in, a ledger keeps score. When Miles grows into the role, responsibility expands with him. When Peter grows, the role expands ahead of him, always staying just out of reach. This is why Miles can still feel joy, why he can still have friends, still laugh, still imagine a future where Spider-Man doesn't erase who he is. Because for Miles, being Spider-Man is something he does, but for Peter, it's become something he owes. Miles proves something crucial. Spider-Man doesn't have to be a life sentence, but Peter never got that version of the story. And once responsibility enters your life abruptly, it doesn't just ask you to rise, it dares you to rest. And that's where the real damage begins. Peter Parker doesn't wake up every morning thinking about guilt. He wakes up thinking about prevention, about what didn't happen yet, about what might happen if he stops paying attention, about the razor-thin margin between one quiet night and another irreversible loss. This is how the debt actually works. Every time Spider-Man saves someone, it doesn't bring peace. It brings relief. Temporary, fleeting, just enough to let him breathe. Saving a life doesn't feel like victory, it feels like postponement, like paying the minimum balance, because the moment Peter Parker stops moving, his mind fills in the worst case scenario. Someone needed help, he wasn't there, and now they're dead. So success becomes a form of permission. Permission to sleep, permission to sit down, permission to take the mask off, just for a few hours. But permission isn't peace, it's conditional, and it can be revoked at any moment. That's why rest feels dangerous for Peter Parker. Rest feels like negligence, like theft, like time he didn't earn, because somewhere, someone might be falling, and if he's not there, then history will repeat itself. The ledger Peter keeps isn't rational. It doesn't care about probability, it doesn't care about exhaustion, it doesn't care how many lives he's already saved. It only remembers one thing, the time he didn't act. And because that memory is seared into his mind, it becomes the reference point for everything else. That's why failure doesn't just hurt Peter, it multiplies. Gwen Stacy isn't just a loss, she's interest accrued, not because Peter caused her death, but because it proved that even perfect effort can still fail. And once that happens, the rules change. Now it's not just act or someone dies, it's act perfectly where the cost is unbearable, because every failure confirms his deepest fear, that stopping, even briefly, means defaulting on the debt. And default to Peter doesn't mean falling behind, it means killing someone by omission. So happiness becomes suspect, joy feels borrowed, moments of peace feel fragile, almost inappropriate. How can he enjoy dinner when someone else is screaming? How can he fall in love when the people he loves are targets? How can he step back when stepping back is the thing that preceded the worst moment of his life? This is how love slowly becomes conditional, and this matters, because Peter doesn't start here. He doesn't become Spider-Man because he hates himself. He becomes Spider-Man because he loves people, because he believes deeply that no one else should lose what he lost. But the debt doesn't erase that love, it weaponizes it. Over time, love stops being the reason and becomes the justification. Not, I want to help, but I have to. Not, I choose this, but I don't get to stop. And that's dangerous. When responsibility is born from such a traumatic event, it doesn't just guide behavior, it revises who you're responsible for. Peter isn't saving people to feel good, he's saving them to feel permitted to exist. And once love is tied to permission, rest becomes guilt, joy becomes suspicion, and choosing yourself starts to feel like betrayal. Peter does love people, deeply, genuinely, but the debt warps that love. It turns protection into obligation, sacrifice into proof, presence into penance. He doesn't save people only because he cares. He saves them because caring isn't enough anymore. He doesn't rest. He patrols, he intervenes, he keeps moving, not because it feels heroic, but because stopping feels immoral. His life becomes a prison. Not the mask, not the powers, not the villains, but a system where goodness is never assumed, only proven, over and over again. And once you start living that way, there is no final payment, because the ledger isn't designed to close, it's designed to keep you running. And the cruelest part, from the outside, it looks like virtue, it looks like dedication, like selflessness, like heroism, but from the inside, it feels like being hunted by a moment that never ended. And the longer Peter survives it, the more convinced he becomes that stopping isn't just risky, it's unforgivable. At some point, the debt stops being something Peter carries. It becomes something he uses to define himself. Because when responsibility never ends, and rest always feels dangerous, you don't just do the work. You start believing that work is the only reason you're allowed to exist. Over time, the debt stops asking Peter what he's done. It starts telling him who he is. Not a student, not a friend, not a man with wants, fears, or limits, but a function. Peter Parker doesn't measure his goodness by intention. He measures it by output. By how many people didn't die today, by how many disasters were delayed, by how much damage was absorbed before it reached someone else. This is where responsibility stops being something Peter carries and starts being something he becomes. Because when goodness is conditional, you stop asking, am I a good person? And you start asking, am I still useful? Peter learns, slowly, painfully, that being needed is safer than being loved. So Peter starts to optimize for usefulness. He becomes dependable. He becomes tireless. He becomes the person everyone calls when something is breaking. And from the outside, it looks admirable. He's always there, always sacrificing, always putting others first. But internally, something corrosive is happening. Because if Peter is only good when he's fixing something, then stopping means he's becoming worthless. And that's where relationships begin to fail. Not because Peter doesn't care, but because guilt always outranks joy. Every quiet moment carries an accusation. Every laugh is interrupted by the question, who is suffering while I'm here? So Peter leaves early, he cancels plans, he disappears. Not because he prefers the mask, but because the mask takes on a life of its own. Spider-Man justifies his absence. Peter Parker does not. This is why Peter's relationships fracture again and again. Not because he chooses the city over the people he loves, but because the debt doesn't allow him to choose at all. Presence becomes a liability, and slowly, subtly, Peter internalizes a devastating equation. If I am not actively preventing harm, I'm causing it. That belief doesn't stay contained. It spreads. It turns into burnout and feels righteous. Exhaustion that feels deserved. A life where stopping isn't relief, it's panic. And this is where the story stops being about Spider-Man, because this is the same equation many men live with every day. Providers who only feel worthy when they're producing. Fathers who can't rest without guilt. Men who don't know how to exist unless something is being fixed. You don't ask, how am I? You ask, what still needs to be done? You don't measure your value by who you are to the people you love, but by what you prevent from falling apart. And just like Peter, you don't feel burned out because you care too little. You feel burned out because caring has become the price of admission. Because somewhere along the way, being needed replaced being valued. And once that switch happens, self-worth becomes performance-based. You're only as good as your last sacrifice. Only as safe as your last success. Only as worthy as the disaster you delayed today. Peter doesn't see himself as a person who sometimes helps. He sees himself as a barrier between chaos and consequence, and barriers don't get to rest. They just absorb impact until something gives. This is the quiet damage of the debt of guilt. It doesn't destroy Peter all at once. It convinces him that self-destruction is the cost of being good, and that belief is far harder to escape than any villain he ever fights. Before we go any further, if you ever felt like your value came from how much you could carry, if you've ever rested and felt guilty for it, if you ever wondered who you'd be if you stopped fixing everything for 5 minutes, then this space was built for you. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, not a show about power levels, not a ranking of wins and losses, but a place to slow down and examine the characters we grew up admiring, and ask what their strength actually cost them. Because heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like endurance, sometimes it looks like burnout, sometimes it looks like men carrying more than they were ever taught how to set down. Over the course of this series, we're asking one question, across comics, myths, and stories. How do we become better men? If that question matters to you, I hope you'll stay. And if you're looking for something more grounded, I've created a free guide called Hang On Superman, a field guide for men under pressure. It's not motivation, not hustle, just a tool to help you recognize the weight you're carrying, start separating responsibility from self-worth. It's linked down below whenever you're ready. And remember, you're not late, you're not behind, you're right on time. By now, it should be clear. This isn't a story about a superhero collapsing under too much responsibility. It's a story about what happens when responsibility is the only place you're allowed to feel valuable. Because once being needed becomes your worth, everything else starts to disappear. And Spider-Man doesn't just lose sleep, he loses himself. He becomes a system, a safeguard, a contingency plan. Ask him who he is, and the answer is no longer a name, it's a function. He's the one who shows up, the one who absorbs impact, the one who prevents the worst case scenario, and systems don't get days off. This is where Peter stops feeling like a character, starts feeling familiar, because this is the same erosion many modern men experience. You start as a person, then a provider, then a role. You're praised for reliability, rewarded for endurance, valued for how much pressure you can absorb without breaking. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, your worth becomes conditional. You're useful when you're solving, valuable when you're producing, respected when you're carrying more than you should. The more you provide, the more people rely on you. The more they rely on you, the less permission you have to rest. Fatherhood sharpens this truth, but it doesn't cheapen it. Because yes, responsibility limits you. Yes, it costs you sleep, ease, and freedom. And yes, it asks more than you ever felt ready to give. But it also gives your life weight, meaning, a reason to stand between danger and the people you love. The problem isn't the burden itself. The problem is when the burden becomes the only place you're allowed to exist. Because responsibility, when chosen, gives your life purpose. But when it's treated as moral debt, it consumes you. This is where Peter Parker still matters. Because even exhausted, even burned down to the nerve, he keeps choosing the mask. Not because he hates himself, but because he believes someone should be there. And if it has to be someone, then it'll be him. That choice matters. It's the same choice fathers make every day. The same choice providers make. The same choice men make when they step forward. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Peter doesn't carry the burden because it's light. He carries it because it's worth carrying. And that's the difference between being crushed by responsibility and being shaped by it. Spider-Man isn't a warning against caring too much. He's a warning against believing you only matter when you're suffering. The burden doesn't have to disappear, but it does have to stop keeping score. Because responsibility was never meant to be a ledger. It was never meant to be paid off. And it was never meant to decide whether you're allowed to rest. Peter Parker keeps choosing the mask because he believes someone should be there. And choosing to carry the burden is not the same as believing you deserve to be crushed by it. You don't have to stop caring. You don't have to stop showing up. You can stop counting. You can stop measuring your worth by how exhausted you are, by how much you sacrificed, by how close you came to breaking. Because responsibility doesn't ask you for erasure. It asks you for presence. And presence, real presence, requires rest, requires joy, requires the man beneath the mask to still be allowed to exist. Peter isn't heroic because he never stops. He's heroic because he keeps choosing to stand even when he lets himself breathe. And that's the difference between responsibility as punishment and responsibility as a vow. Not a debt to repay, but a promise you're allowed to keep without losing yourself in the process. Spider-Man's story doesn't end with a victory. It ends with a question Peter Parker will never answer. Not, did I do the right thing, but have I done enough yet? Peter never forgives himself for the moment Uncle Ben died. And because that forgiveness never comes, the debt never clears. And that belief is what traps him. But this is more than just a story about a man bitten by a radioactive spider. Because many of us live in the same way. We carry responsibilities we would choose again, our families, our work, the people who depend on us, but we carry them like debts instead of vows. We provide, we endure, we show up. And slowly, we start believing we only matter while we're suffering. That being a good father, a good partner, a good man means paying forever. But heroism in a smaller world doesn't look like endless sacrifice. It looks like coming home, like being present, like choosing restraint instead of self-destruction, like understanding that caring deeply doesn't require punishing yourself. Uncle Ben didn't die asking Peter to disappear. He died believing that what you do matters. And that lesson doesn't demand a lifetime of pain. It demands awareness, choice, and eventually mercy. So let me ask you something. What are you paying for, even though the debt should be forgiven by now? This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains. Not a show about perfect heroes, but about learning how to carry responsibility without losing yourself in the process. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow for more. With that, stay thoughtful, stay honest, and as always, stay handsome.